Thank you very much for having us this evening. Those of you who have had the mixed bag of having watched Jerry and me before, whether on television or in some live presentation, it's assumption of the risk for you. You should have known better than to come, and you came anyway. Those of you who weren't aware can blame your friends who knew and came anyway. So thank you so much for the opportunity. And let me say, I only asked for a couple of items of personal indulgence. One is, I just have to thank him in the presence of all of you all. Lee Davis Thames taught me more about being a gentleman and a lawyer than any other single man except for my father. We practiced law together for several years, and I was sort of his go-boy, and I still feel that way. So it does not surprise me at all to learn that he is the brain master behind this event. And then, for those of you who have not had the opportunity, I hope you'll take the moment to meet my bride of 37 years. 3 weeks ago, Karen over here sitting by at Luther. So thank you. You know, Karen rarely comes to hear Jerry and me because she says, that's kind of y'all's job. I don't go to work with you. I don't want to come hear you talk. I hear you talk all the time. But she came tonight, I think, to see Lee Davis and Jane, really. Is what reconciliation. I told Andy when he and Luther asked Jerry and me to do this that the older I get and the more aware I am of my own clay feet, the less interested I am in pontificating to anybody about anything. So let me try to characterize at least my part of the conversation as sort of letting you know all the things that I know how not to do reconciliation. All the ways, right? Thomas Edison wanted to do 87 ways not to build a light bulb before he built one, so he knew 87 ways not to do it. Well, I know lots of ways not to do reconciliation. But there is a reason it strikes me, you all, that the Bible has the staying power that it has, setting aside what many of us believe to be supernatural power in the very Word of God. Set that aside. The Bible has staying power because it is full of truth, even for people who might reject it as divine truth. And some of those truths are in some of the most familiar stories of all and some of the oldest stories of all. So if I may sort of couch my thoughts and examples of how I didn't get it right in the framework of some of those very familiar stories, forgive me for perhaps reciting in some of them details that are very, very familiar to you. But if I do, it's because I think they're particularly important. And the first of the stories that I like to think about is Jacob and Esau, Jacob and Laban, Laban and Jacob, Jacob and Esau, Esau and Jacob. Roughly Genesis 27 through 33. You remember the start of the story of Jacob tricked Esau right out of his birthright, got Isaac to bless him in lieu of the older brother, tricked him. We don't really get all the cultural things that work there, but it was a very, very big deal, so much so that we find out that Esau was so mad he wanted to kill his brother. But what an amazing thing. The guy's so mad he wants to kill his brother, but he honors his father so much that he's going to wait till Dad dies before he kills Jacob. Right? Kind of an amazing bit of human condition there, isn't it? Mama Rebecca hears what Esau has said, tells Jacob, hey, you got to get out of here. Go live with your Uncle Laban until Esau has cooled off. And so Jacob goes to live with Uncle Laban, immediately falls in love with Rachel, cuts a deal with Uncle Laban. I want Rachel as my wife. Says, that would be great. Work for me for 7 years and you can have Rachel. He works for him for 7 years and he gets the ugly sister. He gets Leah. And Jacob said, well, just a minute. By the way, I don't know if the ancient people of Israel believed in karma, but here's a little karma at work, right? Jacob tricks Esau out of his birthright, has to leave because Esau is now so angry, and he cuts a deal with his soon-to-be father-in-law, and his father-in-law tricks him, gives him the wrong girl. He said, but look, no harm, no foul. You can have Rachel too. Just give me another 7 years. So he takes both Leah and Rachel. You know this is a disaster waiting to happen, right? At the same time, and has to work 7 more years. And then he's ready to go, and Uncle Laban says, no, work for me for a while, build up a little nest egg here, and then you can go. And So they kind of haggle about what his wages are going to be. And Laban says, all right, well, your wages will be all the spotted sheep. And then Laban at night goes and gets all the spotted rams and takes them out of the flock, right? So the lady sheep won't have any spotted lambs, but they have spotted lambs anyway. So Jacob starts getting rich. And then Laban says, well, King's X, change the deal. You can have all the striped babies. And so Laban goes in at night and takes all the striped rams out, and thinking that's going to keep the ewes from having any striped babies. But they have striped babies anyway. So Jacob gets richer and richer and richer. Finally, at the end of 20 years, Jacob says, enough. You tricked me about my wife. You've changed my wages 10 times. I'm out of here. Except he doesn't tell Laban exactly when he's going to leave, and he sneaks out at night and makes his way to a place called Mizpah. Now, some of you may remember that, and maybe they still do, trinket shops used to sell Mizpah coins, which was a coin that appeared to be broken in half, and it had half of a scripture verse on one side and the other half on the other side, and the scripture verse says, in paraphrasing it, may God look to the two of us while we are absent from one another. Well, we think of that as such a nice and lovely sentiment, but it wasn't at all. Laban and Jacob set up this pile of stones basically as I got my eye on you, and don't forget, if you ever come back this way again, just don't forget I got my eye on you. That is not reconciliation. That's how they ended up splitting after 20 years of Jacob working for Uncle Laban. But the reason Jacob left was God said, go home, and everything's going to be good. Well, I'm going to tell you, if you're like me, when you're out of fellowship with somebody that you should not be out of fellowship with, you think about it all the time. Consciously or unconsciously, you think about it all the time. It affects all of your life. Our marriage is certainly no model, but Karen and I like being in fellowship a whole lot more than we like being out of fellowship. It just affects everything all the time. So for 20 years, in some way, Jacob's dealing with this, and God says, go back home, everything's going to be fine. And you know the very first thing Jacob must have thought was, everything is not going to be fine. My brother's going to kill me. Dad's dead, and Esau's going to kill me. He really did believe that, and in fact, facts seemed to bear him out. So he starts on his way back home, and he's thinking to himself, okay, I'm going to send somebody ahead of me to sort of like pave the way. And so he sends servants ahead of, and the servants immediately come back and say, hey, no problem. Esau's already coming to see you, and he's got 400 men with him. This is looking really bad. So Jacob, trickster that he is, starts a plan. He said, all right, take 220 goats and 220 sheep and 30 camels. I guess camels are really valuable. 50 head of cattle, 30 donkeys, and one species at a time, take them as gifts to Esau. And whenever he asks what's going on here, say, well, your brother's on the way. This is a gift for you. May he find favor in your sight. And so they do that. They take the sheep and the goats and the donkeys and the camels and the cows and head off towards Esau. Then only Jacob and his wives and children are left. And Jacob has that strange experience where he wrestles with God. Remember, has this wrestling match with God, and his name is changed from Jacob to Israel. And now it's time to gut up and meet Esau. And so then he does what is really a very dishonorable thing. He sends the women and children first, right? His concubine and their children, and his other concubine and her children, and then his wife that he didn't love the most and her children, and then his wife that he loved the most, and Joseph, his youngest son, in the hopes that they can appease Esau before he gets there. And you know, of course, the rest of the story. He sees Esau. Esau falls upon him. They weep on each other's necks, the passage says. And Esau said, what is all this? Who are all these people? What's all this stuff? And he said, the people are the children the Lord has blessed me with, and all this stuff is for you. It's a gift for you, my brother, that I may find grace and favor in your sight. And Esau said, no, I don't want any of that. I got plenty of stuff. And Jacob says, no, please take it, because seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. Such favor have you shown me. I bet I had read that passage 100 times over the course of my life and heard it taught 100 times. But as I was thinking through getting ready for tonight, I read all of that passage together, all the way from Jacob tricking Esau to this moment of reconciliation. And I came upon an aha moment that most of you all probably got when you first read it when you were 9 years old. Jacob says to Esau, "Your face looks like the face of God. You've shown me such favor." And you all, Jacob knew what the face of God looked like because he had wrestled with him the night before. This wasn't just a nice thing that he said to his brother. He was saying, "You look just like God looked." And so maybe this is where we get this little saw that we repeat. To err is human, to forgive divine. Because in the moment that Esau expressed this extraordinary forgiveness to his brother, he looked to his brother like God himself. What a powerful way to think about this whole conversation. But Jacob, having or not karma in his life, wasn't yet done with challenges. Many years passed. His son Joseph, the little boy, is now 17 years old, and he's just a catty 17-year-old, right? He irritates his brothers all the time. His daddy dotes on him all the time because he's the youngest child, gives him this fancy coat that he doesn't give to his brothers. His brother Joseph loves doting it in front of his brothers, tattletales on his brothers. Boy, that had to endear him to them, right? And then has this dream about his brother's sheaves all bowing down to his sheaf. What a strange dream. And of course that irritated them to no end, and so they're just gritting their teeth all the time. Jacob either not knowing this or knowing it and hoping the boys can work it out. Karen and I reared 3 boys, and when our guys got to chest bumping and growling and, arm punching and all the rest of it, she would say, "Why do they do this?" And I said, "They're boys. Boys just do this, right?" "Well, you got to stop it." I said, "I might as well try to stop the sun. Boys do this." So maybe Jacob just wanted the boys to just get it out of their system. But Joseph goes to see the other brothers, and they plot to kill him. And oldest brother says, "No, we can't kill him. We'll figure out something here." And you know the rest of the story. They throw him in a pit for a while, and then they sell him into slavery in Egypt. Pretty bad stuff, no matter how much of a pill he had been at age 17. And what an extraordinary picture of the way the hand of God works and the way we see it if we're looking for it. All these things happening to Joseph, awful as they are, get awfuler in Egypt, right? He goes to work, gets a really good job, works for a guy who entrusts him with his entire estate, and then he gets falsely accused of rape and gets thrown in prison for 2 years. And then he kind of befriends a guy who goes to work for Pharaoh, and he says, "Hey, remember me to Pharaoh and get me out of here." And the guy forgets about him and leaves him in prison. So bad stuff. But in any event, he ultimately, of course, interprets Pharaoh's dream, and that's really good. And Pharaoh adopts him and says, "Boy, you're a really, really smart guy. I just want you to be number 2. You're going to be chief of staff to Pharaoh. You're number 2 in the whole kingdom." And it's a good thing because Joseph was divinely inspired, managed the 7 good years, as we recall. And then when the famine fell, Jacob and his family, still back home in Canaan, were impoverished, had nothing to eat. And so Jacob says, "Hey, go to Egypt. I hear they got lots of grain there." And they go to Egypt, and you know, of course, Joseph, managing all the grain stores, has his own brothers now appear before him to buy grain. And he immediately recognizes them, the passage says. And the passage also says, "And he treated them roughly." Now, because we know the rest of the story, we don't know whether he treated them roughly as a guise at that point, or he really was still working through his anger issues. And even if it was category B, you kind of can give him a pass for it, right? But the passage says he treated them roughly, and he says, "You're spies in the land. You've come to find out our weaknesses." No. We just need something to eat. Our daddy, and lots of brothers, and one of our brothers is dead, and so we just came to get some food. "No, you're spies. You're all going to jail." He sent all of them to jail for 3 days. Now, again, we know the rest of the story. We know they were only in jail for 3 days. For all they knew, they were going to be in jail forever. He says, "I'm going to decide which one of you I'll let go back to your father, and I want your baby brother to come here. Then I might believe you. And of course, they're not having any of that. Jacob's still mad at them about Joseph dying. He's sure not going to let Benjamin go all the way to Egypt, right? But then you can see Joseph softening some, or at least his plan unveiling, because he lets all of them go except for one. He keeps one in jail. Sends all the rest back. They tell the whole story to Jacob. He said, we got to take Benjamin back to get Simeon out of jail. And Jacob's having none of it. No, you're not taking my baby boy to Egypt. I already lost Joseph. Now you got Simeon in jail in Egypt. You think I'm letting you take my baby boy? No, you are not. And so a year goes by. Famine gets worse. They get poor. They have no food. Jacob says, all right, we got to do it. So sends Benjamin with the boys. They go back to Egypt. Joseph sees them again, goes into his private chamber and weeps. And goes through this ruse before he finally reveals himself to them. They all have this amazing crying spell. And on their reconciliation, his restoration of his family to good health and to good fortune, the dad comes, everybody's happy and whole. And at the end of the book of Genesis, in chapter 50, the passage says that Jacob has now died, and all of the family has moved to Egypt. And the brothers are afraid, now that Dad is dead, Joseph is going to wreak revenge on us. And they come and say, please, out of honor and respect for our father, please accept us as your servants. And Joseph says that wonderful passage in Genesis chapter 50, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. But he had to work his way there a little bit, right? Final vignette, and then I want to defer to Jerry. Paul's Damascus Road experience, right? Remember, he in chapter 7 of Acts, he is consenting to the stoning death of Stephen. Beginning of chapter 8, he's enraged and he's roving to and fro through the countryside, going into people's homes, arresting them and throwing them in prison for worshiping Christ. And then Jesus appears to him on the road to Damascus in chapter 9, right? And he is struck blind. He goes into this home. And Ananias is sent to him by having received a vision from God. Hey, I want you to go tend to this guy. And Ananias says, "Wait, you got to be kidding me, Lord. He's been throwing people in jail." No. I've told him to expect you. I'm telling you, go to him. So Ananias did. Helped him regain his sight. Then this really remarkable thing happens. Saul, now becomes Paul as we know, starts going to worship with the Christians, and they're really nervous about it, and they don't want to interact with him. And in Jerusalem, Barnabas sort of takes him under his wing and makes sure the other disciples begin to develop a sense of trust for him. But I'm not sure that's exactly reconciliation. That he was earning their trust over time after having been a sworn enemy of the way. But Paul's recitation of that experience in chapter 26, he told it at least twice that we know of in Scripture, but the last one he says it in a different way than he ever did. He said, "And I heard this voice from heaven, I saw this light, and it's, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It hurts you to kick against the goads." The passage in chapter 26 is the only place where he uses that interesting little sentence. It hurts you to kick against the goads. Don't we know that is right? Don't we know when we are out of fellowship that it just hurts? It just makes everything ill. It makes work go bad that day. It makes supper go bad. Even a good glass of wine doesn't make you feel better. When you're kicking against the goads because you're out of fellowship, everything is wrong. And so Jesus wins Paul into right relationship. And then Paul writes this wonderful passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. God was in Christ reconciling the world unto himself. And he has made us ministers of that reconciliation. We are ambassadors for Christ. And so we beg you, be reconciled to God. And how do I do that? Well, Jesus tells us in the Sermon on the Mount to be reconciled with God, includes being reconciled with man. In Matthew chapter 5, he turns on its head what you and I might think is meant by reconciliation. That's the passage, you remember, where he says, you've heard it said, but I say unto you. You've heard it said, but I say unto you. In the first of those, he says, you've heard it said, do not kill, but I say, don't even be angry. Don't call anybody a fool. Don't insult. Don't hate. And then he has this passage in Matthew 5:23 that turns our idea of reconciliation on its head. If you are bringing your sacrifice to the altar and you remember that your brother has something against you, go and be reconciled to your brother and then come and bring your sacrifice. That's not the way we typically think about reconciliation. We usually think about reconciliation as, when I have something against my brother, I'm going to take a deep breath and be the better person and go to them and work it out. And usually reconciliation, the way we think about it, has at least a little sliver of personal human pride involved. I'll set my pride aside because I'm the better person so I can be reconciled with you. That's not what the passage says. It says, when you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your sacrifice there and go and be reconciled with the person who has a claim against you, a charge against you, an offense that you have caused. Then come back and offer your sacrifice. Or, to be reconciled with God, be first reconciled with man. Many of you know Karen's and my personal story. We reared 3 boys, but we lost our youngest to suicide 7.5 years ago. And we are intellectually able and reasonably spiritually mature enough that we can tell you in good conscience we don't blame ourselves for that. There are lots of second guesses that you wish you would always have done differently in all of the rearing of our children. But we don't blame ourselves for Brad's death. But I will tell you a burden that I bear every day. And it is that in all of my conversations with my sons, I always try to end that conversation with, I love you, son. My last conversation with Brad was the morning of his death. I was in Chicago, and he had not taken the garbage out. And so I called him. He was, at the time, living at home with us, and I called him and growled at him. I want to think that at the end of that conversation, notwithstanding that it was a tense conversation, that I told him I love him, but I don't remember that I did. And so that experience has not made me a better person. It has made me remember that everybody's carrying around a bag of sand. And I need to be a little gentler in my conversations with people. I can be a growly person. Doesn't mean, I don't think I'm a mean person, but I can be growly. I can be abrupt. I perfectly well know that. Karen says, Andy, you need to learn to be more interruptible. You're not interruptible, and people know you don't like being interrupted. She tells me just like that. The closest I will come to pontificating, Andy, and with which I will close and defer to Jerry, is try to converse as though you might not have another opportunity to have that conversation. And perhaps our lives will be marked by a spirit of reconciliation.
I have to tell y'all that I came with some prepared remarks, but after listening to the bishop and after listening to Andy, I feel like a complete heathen compared with their theological and spiritual observations about reconciliation. But not to be outdone with Andy introducing Karen, I would hope that you would make welcome my wife, Holly Wagner, and her mother. we are in a spirit of reconciliation and celebrating this idea of windows that honored the Union and Confederate armies at the same time. You should welcome Wilma because she's from New England. As is Holly Wagner. So, you can imagine the first thing that my mother,
Don't go there.
who I don't know that she ever got north of the Mason-Dixon line her entire life, the first thing she said when I told her about Holly, she said, "You're marrying a Yankee?" So it's in that spirit that we celebrate reconciliation. I have to tell y'all that in 2003, when I sort of came up with this idea of writing a book of political history of Mississippi, I knew that if I, a liberal Democrat, were to write a book about political history in Mississippi, nobody right of me would ever read it. So I knew I needed to have a Republican co-author. Because if a Republican wrote a book about Mississippi political history, nobody to the left of the Republican would read it. So the one and only person I considered as a co-author was Andy Taggart. And I rode out to his office in Madison one day, sat down in his office, explained to him what I wanted to do and that I wanted to do it with him. And I wanted us to do it together and wanted us to do it in the same voice. And as he likes to remember, he tried to kick me out of his office and said that he had no interest in it. He had just left a major law firm and went out on his own, just got himself elected to the Madison County Board of Supervisors, was sort of living life to the fullest, and here I was fixing to extract 2 years of his life to help write a book. But what I didn't know, because I knew that the book would be published in 2006 and we would hit the trail talking about the book, making speeches, signing books, telling all sorts of stories. But it never occurred to me that I was asking someone to co-author this book who was a Sunday school teacher. And had been a Sunday school teacher for 30 years. I mean, besides the ministers who are here, who can recite that stuff from memory? I mean, Saul and Esau, and you're right, the last time I read that was in the 9th grade.
I'm just proud to know you read it.
I mean, really? Look, if I didn't get that from it either, buddy. I mean, come on, I'm supposed to follow that?
I had to follow the bishop himself.
I got to have another lozenge. Damn. But here's the deal. To your point, I rarely let myself hate anyone. I am not going to let somebody do that to me. But there was a time when I really did not like Andy Taggart. Now, y'all have got to know, how much time do I have?
Look at the time.
Y'all have got to know that in 1987, I ran Ray Mavis's campaign for governor. He was elected, and I ultimately became his chief of staff. 1991, I ran his re-election campaign for governor. Andy Taggart was a volunteer for Kirk Fordyce's campaign and took over my office as Kurt Fordyce's chief of staff. Not only did he take over my office, but Fordyce doubled his pay. And the Lord wanted me to reconcile that.
You should have been a Republican then.
And that was 1991. And Andy, at some point, I think he left in 95. He managed Fordyce's re-election campaign in 95. And joined a lobbying firm with two really close friends of mine who I spent a lot of time with. And I've been over to their offices several times, and they finally tricked me into coming when Andy was there. And I did not like that. And it took me a while to get over it. But whether it's the movement of the Holy Spirit or the movement of something else, Andy and I went and had lunch one day. And we had another lunch. And in 2000, 2001, which I'm going to get to a little bit later in these prepared remarks, we sort of got together and started doing projects together. And in 2003, he and I teamed up, wrote this book of political history in Mississippi, and went on a speaking tour. And for 2 or 3 years, must have given hundreds of speeches about the book. And then we decided to do another book. And wrote another book about political history in Mississippi, and have been close friends ever since. Of course, Andy's favorite thing that he likes to say is, Jerry Nash is the smartest person that I've ever met. He's just wrong all the time. You know, right?
That's a fact.
All right. On to the prepared remarks, finally. So I want to give a tip of the hat to Tim Abel. When he and I got together and to talk about what we're doing tonight, and he explained the significance of the reconciliation windows, I looked at him and I said, something's missing. And he said, I know. In 1880, when those windows were dedicated, there were 8,700 white people living in Warren County. There were also 22,500 former slaves living in Warren County. Missing, of course, was any attempt at reconciliation with the former slaves. Missing was any attempt at atonement for slavery. But to have asked the white citizens of Warren County or the white citizens of Mississippi in 1880 to do that, to go there, would have been impossible. Would have been impossible. You and I today, sitting in this room, we can't even appreciate or comprehend or fathom the cultural norms in Mississippi during the Civil War era, when this church was built. Today we throw around words like racist and white supremacy, and we have no idea what those words mean. A racist is someone who believes that races are genetically inferior or superior to other races, that the DNA is different. A racist believes that there is a hierarchy of races and that some races are better than others. A racist believes that all men and women are not created equal. Now, when somebody is called a racist today, the hundreds of times that it happens throughout the day, they're not real racists. It is a sloppy use of the word. But in 1880, Virtually every white Mississippian was a racist. White Mississippians believed that whites were superior to blacks, that the slaves could not manage a farm by themselves, could not learn, could not genetically contribute to society. That is what they believed. Hardly anyone today believes that. And that's why those windows in 1880 make no attempt at reconciliation with the former slaves, because whites in Mississippi, whites throughout the South, whites in other parts of the country believed that they were not equal, that they were not due that kind of legitimate understanding. This idea about racism was brought home to me when I drove to Greenville one day in writing the book to interview Victor McTeer. Andy and I had decided a major focus of the book was going to be on voting rights and reapportionment. Many of those cases came before a federal district judge in Jackson by the name of Harold Cox. Some of you may know Harold Cox, who easily had the reputation of being the most anti-civil rights judge in the South. But even being the most anti-civil rights judge in the South, he had friendly relationships with a lot of his lawyers, including Victor McTeer, a black civil rights lawyer from my hometown of Greenville. So I drove to Greenville one day to do an interview with Vic McTeer, and we talked about his cases, and I said, "Tell me about Harold Cox." And he said, "Well, one day, Judge Cox and I were in his chambers having a conversation. Only in Mississippi, by the way, can somebody as anti-civil rights as Judge Harold Cox and an activist black civil rights lawyer named Victor McTeer have a cordial conversation in the judge's chambers," but they did. And at some point during the conversation, Vic McTeer remembered Judge Cox saying, "Vic, I just want you to know, I am not a racist, but I am a bigot." And it brought home to me the difference between those terms and how we ought to be more careful in the way that we use certain terms to throw at other people. But in Mississippi in 1880, that's what white Mississippians believed. And as soon as they were able to regain control of state government in 1875 and in Reconstruction, they knew they could not reenact slavery. So they enacted the next best thing, and that was Jim Crow. They began to pass laws to separate the races, to deny blacks opportunities, to denigrate blacks. And over time, cultural norms developed that went beyond the law books. Some of you may know Reuben Anderson, first black Supreme Court justice in Mississippi. Andy and I decided that we needed to interview Judge Anderson, and we had a long oral history with him, and I asked him to talk about his childhood growing up. And he remembered growing up that if he were walking on a sidewalk and a white person was coming to him on the sidewalk, he'd better get off that sidewalk. He was not allowed to walk on the same sidewalk and pass a white person. That was not in any law book, but it was part of the cultural norm of the time. Jim Crow lasted in Mississippi for 90 years, from 1875 to 1965, when the Civil Rights Act was passed and the Voting Rights Act was passed. In 1880, 58% of the state's population was black. By 1900, the turn of the century, the black population was 61%. Mississippi did not become a white majority state until 1940. Over the breadth of the state's history, the majority of our citizens were never provided an opportunity to participate in their government, in the state's economy, in the state's educational system, in the cultural life of the state. Imagine what we lost by that. Imagine what we lost by that as a state. Imagine the promise of millions of lives that was lost. Those of you who know your Warren County history have a really good example of what we lost, because you know about Davis Bend. Davis Bend was a peninsula from the Louisiana line jutting out into the Mississippi River about 15 miles south of here. But the land itself was part of Warren County, was part of Mississippi. And the plantations on Davis Bend were owned by a guy named Joseph Davis, Jefferson Davis's older brother, about 16 years. Joseph Davis, while he owned more than 200 slaves on Davis Bend, thought a lot different than his brother Jefferson. And he created a cooperative farming environment on Davis Bend that gave the slaves rights and privileges that they were able to have nowhere else in Mississippi. And he met a guy named Benjamin Montgomery, slave on the plantation, and he realized what every other person who ever met Benjamin Montgomery knew, is that this guy is a genius. And so he allowed Benjamin Montgomery, a slave, to manage his plantation day to day. Even allowed him to open a store and run a business with the other slaves on Davis Bend. Before the Civil War, it was one of the most successful plantations in the South. After the war, Davis's health deteriorated in 1867. He sold it to Benjamin Montgomery. And for about 10 years, Benjamin Montgomery, through a cooperative farming environment with all of the former slaves, rebuilt the plantation, and it also became a model for success. By early 1880s, Jim Crow had set in, Reconstruction was over, and white hostility shut down Davis Bend. But before it shut down, Benjamin Montgomery's son, Isaiah Montgomery, took many of the former slaves, moved to Bolivar County, where they bought some land. And Isaiah Montgomery wanted to create an all-black farming operation in Bolivar County to show the rest of the world what former slaves could do. It's called Mound Bayou. And for 5 years, they became one of the most successful farming operations in the country until white hostility shut them down. If you want to do racial reconciliation, in Mississippi, you have to come face to face with the most powerful force known to nature. When I went through engineering school at Louisiana Tech, we were taught there were 4 fundamental forces of nature: gravity, electromagnetic radiation, which govern your cell phones, the weak nuclear force, which describes the reactions in a nuclear bomb, and the strong nuclear force, which governs the operation of stars like the sun in producing energy. I've come to believe there's a 5th force that's far more powerful, and it's called peer pressure. Peer pressure was the glue that whites used to maintain 90 years of Jim Crow. White politicians, business leaders, religious leaders, they sort of delivered the message, and whites were required to get in line. And it was peer pressure that prevented individual whites from standing up to that, from being different. In 1875, halfway through the building of this church, a man named Blanche Bruce was elected to the U.S. Senate from Mississippi. Blanche Bruce was the second African-American United States Senator after Hiram Revels, also from Mississippi, became the first African-American United States Senator. Blanche Bruce was elected by the legislature in 1874 and was scheduled to be sworn in early 1875 in Washington. And as the tradition usually is, on the day that senators are sworn in, the junior senator who's going to be sworn in is escorted down the center aisle by the state's senior senator to the well of the Senate to take the oath of office. So early in March 1875, the entire Washington establishment was there in the Senate galleries because this was a big deal. Blanche Bruce from Mississippi, Republican, African-American, going to become a U.S. Senator, the first African-American to serve a full 6-year term. Hiram Revels served out the remainder of another term. And so everybody was gathered in the Senate chamber. And the President of the Senate called by name Blanche Bruce to come to the front of the Senate. And he stood up. And he expected the state's senior senator, James Alcorn, white man from Coahoma County, to stand up and meet him and escort him. But when he stood up, he looked across the Senate chamber and he saw Alcorn reading the newspaper. And he never stood up. The President of the Senate called Bruce's name again. And Bruce began to make his way down his aisle to get to the center aisle to walk to the front of the Senate. And as Bruce was making his way down to the aisle, he was hoping against all hope that Alcorn would stand up and escort him. But Alcorn was still reading the newspaper. So Bruce started walking down the aisle by himself. The place was stone cold silent. And halfway down the aisle, a little man named Roscoe Conklin, senior senator from New York, stood up. And he said, where everybody could hear it, Senator Bruce, it would be my honor to escort you for your oath of office. He grabbed Bruce's arm, walked him to the well of the Senate, where Bruce received the oath of office. Blanche Bruce and his wife had one son. His name was Roscoe Conklin Bruce. Imagine what Mississippi would be like if more people had stood up for 90 years. Imagine what we would be like today if more people stood up and bucked peer pressure to be different. Fast forward to 2002. In the spring of 2002, I had a date with a federal judge in New York City. I was going to be sentenced for a crime I had committed in New York, federal crime, some years before that. I had testified in 3 trials in New York as a cooperating witness, and the time had come, I was the last one to be sentenced in May of 2002 for the felony that I had pled to. My good friend Alan Moore took it upon himself to contact all my friends and solicit letters from all my friends to send to the judge as part of a packet of material my lawyer was going to get to the judge, hoping that I would avoid prison time, hoping that I would get a lenient sentence. At some point during that whole 5-month period, Andy Taggart called Alan Moore and said, I want to send a letter. Now, I had not gone to see Andy. This was not 2003. We had not done a book together. I had just got over my dislike. And we had started doing stuff together. This is the spring of 2002. Now, think about this. He had just got out on his own. He was a year away from running for supervisor of Madison County as a Republican in a Republican primary. And he was calling my friend Alan Moore to say, I want to write a letter on behalf of a liberal Democrat who violated a law in New York, helping a union leader get elected to a post. He was willing to do that, knowing that it could come out. These were public letters. Knowing that an opponent could use it against him. But he did it anyway. Every time Andy Taggart talks about the need for a new flag, every time Andy Taggart rebuts the position of his party on immigration, he is engaging in reconciliation. Every time he preaches reconciliation, he's not just preaching it. Every time he and I have spoken together and somebody in the audience takes him on about the flag or takes him on about immigration, he stands right there and he fights back. He takes on peer pressure. He's willing to be different to reconcile harms that he knows had been caused by other people. Thank you.
So party favors are being passed out. Party favors are being passed out. Right? Pass this around. We have 5 minutes. It's 7:40, so this is just perfect. There's been great wisdom, great powerful words, great thoughts. This was a night to plant seeds. With this party favor, as you see, it is a picture of the reconciliation window. It's a memento for this night. But I'm going to ask that with any gift we receive, to complete the gift is we give it away. The forefathers and foremothers of Holy Trinity, in whatever context that was, made the first move. They made the first move. Andy Taggart made the first move. Jerry Nash made the first move. Bishop Sloan spoke about making the first move. So I'm hoping tonight that this can be a gift for you to give to someone else. Making the first move, whatever it is. In high school, we aren't taught how to reconcile. In college, I went to Ole Miss, there was nothing about reconciliation there. I went to seminary twice. No classes about reconciliation. The Bible is filled with stories about reconciliation. We're called to be ambassadors for reconciliation with very little training, except the notion to know that we aren't better than anybody else, and nobody's better than us, and that a God who loves us so much wants us to be restored with God and each other. So I hope this party favor, you can use it. There's enough if somebody needs two. But I want you to go out and give it to someone. I want you somehow, in your own way, without training, without much practice at this, just tell people about that great act that people in Warren County in 1880 did, and say, if they can do it, we can do it. If they can do it, then I can do it. Each one of us in here, unfortunately, has someone that in conflict with that we can give this to. I'm thinking of a person right now, burning in my soul. And Andy Taggart, you're right. It eats you alive. It eats you up all the time. So we're planting seeds. This has been a great night. Can we say we love William Furlong? Mrs. Gumbo and all of his amazing helpers that were in there. Can we say we love Lee Davis Thames? Lutherot helped. This was really your Gene. Can we say we love Lutherot? We love Andy Taggart. Yes, we love Jerry Nash. Mr. Sloan. We love you. Hey, hey. So we have a party favor. We've heard so many beautiful things. So as it comes, may we know that we're in good fellowship as we make the first move with somebody. We're in good fellowship as we make the first move. So be careful as you go home. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here.